Hello and welcome to my easy to understand guide about evaluating theory for A-level, in particular for the Component 2 exam, EDUCAS exam board. A lot of people have been asking me, how on earth do I evaluate a theory? And it is quite complex and a very strange thing to have to do. So I've tried to put together a PowerPoint explaining this with my voice on it. So hopefully this is helpful and it gives you some examples about how to do this and how to revise for it as well.
Okay, so for EDUCAS A-level Media Studies, there could be questions on Component 2 that ask you to evaluate media theories. I know that evaluation of media theories comes up on the specification for other exam boards as well. So evaluation of media theories is important to be able to understand. But for EDUCAS, like I say, it'll be Component 2, and it could be a question in any of the three topic areas. There will be at least one question that asks you to evaluate a media theory on every Component 2 exam that you might sit. So it's important to be able to understand how to evaluate a theory. And evaluating a theory is not the same as applying a theory. So I just want to highlight what the difference is and then give you some tips as to how to practice and prepare for evaluation questions. So some questions might ask to see if you can apply a theory. So for example, this question here is like an example. It just says, it might see if you can apply post-colonialist ideas like Paul Gilroy to TV, for example. And applying a theory might involve things like seeing if humans or whichever TV program you're studying reflects Gilroy's theories or not. So does it actually show post-colonialist ideas? But applying a theory isn't the same as evaluating a theory. And if the question asks you to evaluate a theory, such as Gilroy or any other theorist, it needs you to do more than just see if that theory fits. So you can't just say, oh, well, yeah, this TV program has some post-colonialist ideas, or yes, this shows some evidence of feminist theories. You have to do more for an evaluation question. So evaluation, much like if you've done science or maths and you've ever had to evaluate an experiment you've done or a theory that you've kind of tried to test out, an evaluation is normally asking you to comment on how well something went or how good something is. So an evaluate question for media studies is asking you to comment on how good you think a theory is for looking at a particular product or type of product. Now, a good theory, now obviously that's a bit subjective, but if you think about it, if you were trying to tell somebody what a good theory actually is, a good theory explains something, and preferably explains quite a lot about that product. It helps you to really understand it. A good theory is often accurate. So here's where you could do some discussion about whether or not you can apply that theory. So it's not that you can't talk about application of theory at all, it's just that you've got to do a little bit more. So you might talk about how accurate the theory seems to be. And a good theory can be applied to a lot of different things. So it might be able to be applied to more than one magazine, for example, maybe a whole range of magazines. This theory might help to explain. Maybe this theory helps to explain a whole range of things about different TV programs and not just one TV program, for example. So these are some ideas about how to think about whether a theory is a good theory. Some evaluation questions are asking you to make a judgment, an argument with a judgment and a kind of conclusion. So you're trying to tell the examiner how good you think a theory is for explaining a product. It's important to note that in questions that are evaluating or asking you to evaluate a theory, it doesn't ask you to analyse the media product using that theory. So you don't necessarily have to pick apart particular scenes or shots from a TV programme. You don't have to talk about how the theory applies to certain pages of the magazine, but you might want to include some of it as part of your evaluation. But it certainly shouldn't be like the focus of your whole answer. You might want to think about this, arguing that a theory doesn't fit a particular product, but that doesn't necessarily evaluate its usefulness. So, for example, you might argue if you're studying magazines, my students study Huck and Woman's Realm for A-level, you might argue that a particular theory doesn't really help us to understand Huck, for example. But that doesn't mean it's not useful for understanding magazines as a whole industry or magazines as a whole form. Just because it's not useful for one magazine or one TV program or one online media vlogger, for example, it doesn't mean it's not useful for helping us to understand that whole kind of media form, overall. And you don't need to explain the theory to the examiner. Some students really like this idea that they're going to go in and spend like 2 or 3 paragraphs explaining the theory, and some of the theories are quite complex. You don't need to do that. The examiner knows the theories. They're going to assume that you know the theories, hopefully. You can include maybe a sentence explaining part of a theory, but then it has to be, don't explain it unless there's a point to your explanation. So try and keep your points evaluative or analytical and not explanatory, if that makes sense. So this is a list of all the theories that are set theorists. I think this list is pretty standard across all the exam boards. This is certainly the list for EDUCAS A-level media studies, but I'm pretty sure it is a standard list now for all the exam boards at A-level. And any of these theories could come up in an evaluative question. And I suppose what you've got to think about is which theory is most likely for different products. So for magazines, for example, it's unlikely that for magazines they would ask you, for example, about fandom, Henry Jenkins fandom. It's unlikely that they would ask you about Todorov for something like online media, but it doesn't mean it's not possible, I suppose. Your teachers can give you a list of which theories could come up for which topics, because most exam boards do provide that, and EDUCAS certainly have, as part of their specification, a list of which theories might get asked about for the different topics in component 2, but it does mean that you're going to need to understand the theories. So I've got an example question here. This question says, evaluate the usefulness of Barthes' theory of semiotics when studying magazines. Now, I know some people love to leave comments on my videos and say that his name is pronounced Bart. He is French, and the French pronunciation would be Bart. But I always say Barthes because it helps my students remember the spelling. But certainly evaluate the usefulness of his theory of semiotics when studying magazines. That's quite a vague question. And obviously in the exam, if you don't understand his theory, it's going to be very hard to answer. So I'm going to give you some step-by-step instructions as to how to start this. So your first step is to identify what his theory helps us to understand about magazines. So this is basically why it's useful, why it's good. So think about the magazines that you've studied for component 2. My students study Huck and Woman's Realm. How do his ideas about things like enigma codes, cultural codes, proetic or action codes help us to understand the pages of Huck? What about his semantic codes? If we're looking at the front cover of Woman's Realm and things like that, how do things like semantic codes or symbolic codes help us to understand the pages of Woman's Realm? And why is that a useful theory to consider? So I've given you some points here. So his ideas about codes in general, they help us to understand the potential connotations of design elements, such as the masthead, the images, pull quotes. So for example, his semantic codes ideas help us to understand why something might be a particular color, why it might be a particular size. This idea, it might help us to understand why Huck is called Huck. It might help us to understand the representations in the image of the lady on the front from Öcalan's Angels, why those images, why that outfit, why that direct address to the audience. So his ideas about codes, as part of his theory, do help us to understand what things might connote. So that helps us perhaps to analyse the pages of magazines in general. And that therefore helps us to understand what the potential intended messages of a product were. So, when looking at Woman's Realm and we're seeing Cupid love hearts on the contents page, and we're thinking about symbolic codes, and we understand the intended message is about Valentine's Day and love and marriage. we can, through his theory, it is actually useful in helping us to pick apart those elements of design, the media language choices, and understanding what the meaning might be. But the next step is to then think about what it doesn't help us to understand. Why might it not be useful? Does it make any assumptions that aren't always true? So is there anything in Huck or Woman's Realm, or whichever magazines you're studying, that is not explained by Barthes's semiotic theory? So I've given you some ideas here. I've said that his theory assumes that all audiences will interpret these codes in the same way. So his ideas about things like symbolic codes and semantic codes, it kind of suggests that everyone is going to understand them and that everyone is going to interpret them in the same way. It doesn't take into consideration things like negotiated or oppositional readings. Remember, that's Stuart Hall's reception theory. So perhaps you could bring in the fact that his Stuart Hall's reception theory might help us to understand a slightly deeper part of these codes. It might not help us, Barthes's semiotic theory might not help us to appreciate that some people are not going to understand codes. Huck, in particular, is a very complex magazine aimed at an audience with quite a lot of education and cultural capital. And Barthes's semiotic theory doesn't really take into consideration that not all audiences are going to understand those codes. His theory also doesn't explain why the producers of magazines might have coded their products in that way. So, for example, it might tell us what their intended meaning was, but it doesn't tell us anything about who made the magazine or the power of the company, the structure of the company behind it. So it might help us to understand the messages of a product, but not necessarily anything about the producers or the institution. So that's kind of what points you would make if you got this kind of question about evaluating the usefulness of Barthes's semiotic theory. The problem is there are a lot of theories and a lot of particular texts that could come up. So the next step, once you've done that with something like Barthes and magazines, the next step is to stick with that topic of magazines, but start working your way down the list of theorists and see for each one why that theory or theorist might be useful for looking at that particular type of product and why it might not be useful, like what are the weaknesses. So you might then go to Todorov and then Neil and then Levi Strauss, for example, and each theorist you might only take 10-15 minutes preparing like bullet points for. But that means in theory that you should be prepared for any kind of evaluative question for magazines and theorists that could come up for component 2. Sometimes some theories you will find you're saying exactly the same thing about for another theory, and that's fine, because there are some theories that are very similar, and there are some theories whose pros and cons or strengths and weaknesses are very similar, and that's fine. As long as you've maybe considered them before you go into the exam, that would be useful. So just to give you another example, this is basically the same question, but I've substituted Barthes for Van Zunen. So evaluate the usefulness of Van Zunen's feminist theories when studying magazines. So remember that first step is to think about what her theories help us to understand, what they help to explain about magazines. So I've said her theory helps us to understand and to recognise some of the sexualisation of women in many magazines. You know, the vast majority of magazines on the market have sexualized images of women. So, for example, in Woman's Realm magazine, there's the woman surfing in a kind of bikini with, I don't know, is it sultanas or raisins in her hand? So, you know, it's helping us to recognize those sexualized representations and stereotypes of women. Also, her theory helps us to recognise the way women are represented in domestic ways. So, for example, in Woman's Realm, when we're seeing women cooking and cleaning, her theory very much helps us to see and to recognise those stereotypical representations and to understand that those representations may have been done to reflect mainstream ideologies about gender. And her theory definitely helps us to understand like the patriarchal structure of many media industries and organizations, because she says that these representations are put in place because, you know, men are often the ones that create the representations. So it might help us to understand this idea of patriarchy in the media. So there are some useful points to her theory, and certainly when you're looking at some magazines and some pages of different magazines, you will recognise those representations of sexualised women and domesticated women that she mentions in her theory. However, then the next step is to think about those limitations, what the theory doesn't explain or what the theory assumes. So I've said her theory doesn't really account for any alternative representations by non-mainstream products. She very much focuses on mainstream representations of women in the media. So it doesn't really help us to understand things like Huck, because Huck is an alternative contemporary magazine, much like if you're studying things like The Big Issue, for example, very similar. And so you will find quite alternative representations in those magazines of women. So, for example, in the skateboarding article in Huck, the representations of women in that article are very alternative. The women are not domestically represented. They are not sexualized. They're seen doing active extreme sports like skateboarding. They are seen through the eyes of equality with male skateboarders, mixing and mingling different genders. And so her theory doesn't really help to explain that. And her theory only focuses on representation of women, and it does not help us to understand the representation of other people or groups. So, for example, there's a lot of men in Huck. There's a lot of male people featured in the GoPro advert. There's non-binary people featured in the Beyond Binary articles. There's men talked about within the Osterland's Angels article. There's ethnic minorities in almost every page of the magazine. Her theory does not help us to understand how they have been represented or why they've been represented in those ways at all. And so Van Zoonen's ideas, Van Zoonen's theories are great for helping us perhaps to understand mainstream representations of women, but that's kind of where it ends. Her theory is limited in that it doesn't really tackle any other kind of representations, and it doesn't look at alternative media products, really just focuses on the mainstream ones. So that's the kind of strengths and weaknesses of Van Zoonen's theory in terms of how useful it is. And so you work your way through the theories, and then the next step, once you've worked your way through the theories, you then repeat that process for all of the other topics. So once you've done every theory for magazines, for example, you would then repeat that process for online media, and then again for TV, or whichever your topics are for whatever exam board you are studying. You might try and start thinking about how useful is Barthes when you are evaluating, when you are analysing and looking at humans and the returned, for example, for TV. How useful is it to think about, postmodernism and Baudrillard when looking at Zoella or Alfie, and working your way through all of those theories and trying to come up with at least a couple of bullet points of strengths and weaknesses of why they might be useful and what their limitations are. I've put some sentence starters on here because I think it's quite useful. Some people find it quite hard to incorporate theory into a sentence. So this evaluative sentence starters. So X's theory is useful for, or the problem with X's theory is that X's theory does not explain. The something theory helps us to appreciate why. So use some of these sentence starters to help you start writing about theories in an evaluative way, in a way that is showing your judgments and conclusions. There's a really there's a few tips. There's a really great document, which is the link here, which you can find on the OCR blog. Now, I don't teach the OCR specification or exam board, but I know that having looked at this article, this particular document, it's useful no matter what exam board you teach or study. You can Google it. Even if you look at like evaluating theory and OCR media studies, you can Google that phrase and you will come up with this document. It's really great because it talks about how to evaluate theory and it gives you some examples of what I've just done, but for different types of text. And using quotes or specific words from the question in your answer. So if the question is evaluate how useful a theory is, make sure you are using the phrase, you know, John Doe's theory is very useful when discussing TV, because so using those keywords from the question will really help to focus your answer.
So that was my easy to understand guide to evaluating a theory at A level, in particular for the EDUCAS Component 2 exam. If you've got any other questions, please let me know. Don't forget to hit subscribe to get other videos that would be useful for you at A level for Media Studies.